I worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 23 years. I resigned when I was the forest supervisor of the largest national forest in the lower continental U.S. This century, I created an organization called Sustainable Obtainable Solutions, SOS, and I work in 3 areas there. Its mission is to ensure the sustainability of public lands and the sustainability of the plant, animal, and human communities that depend on public lands. In SOS, I work primarily in climate change, in large landscape conservation strategies, and in promoting the sustainable production and use of biochar. I've also been working in localization, in particular helping to start the transition movement in Helena, Montana, my hometown. Now, all of those elements are interconnected, but what I started to realize that the transition movement was actually kind of an outlier to my work, because there was no discussion about the role of public lands in the transition movement. So that missing piece made me ask the question, who's minding the commons? Well, all of us are. And all of us are also quite affected by the crises that we face, including public land management agencies. And so I wanted to begin exploring, what do you do when the caretakers can't take care of the land? Because the land holds our vital life support systems. So I'm calling this new initiative Wild Transitions. So what are the commons? Well, mutually shared gifts that keep giving, and technically a set of assets that are all gifts and all shared by an identified group for identified purposes. Now, these groups may be inclusive, but typically they're inclusive within a defined group. And they have the charter of the highest good prevailing, that's the highest good for the group, and certainly there's a sustainability imperative and a sense of legacy for future generations. And very importantly, the goods are not typically commoditized. Now that's pretty specific and it's pretty heady, but what I have found is that most of the commons are actually a hybrid version of that. There are expected inputs, it's not just a gift for free, and there are governances, and there may be some contributions or taxes or something else that's necessary to continue to sustain those commons. Now, if we look at the spectrum of commons, it can go from very broad to very focused. It can cover land, resources, culture, arts, infrastructure, entertainment, community, and have different forms of governance. The area that I want to focus on is the broad column, and one where we're looking at the larger environment, and our relationship to the commons is by birthright. If you were born in the United States, for instance, then you have a right to use the public lands that are held in trust for U.S. citizens. Likewise in other states, or in other countries, excuse me. The commons, well, one of our earliest examples is the Boston Common. Very nice 75-acre park, a refreshing open space in the middle of a very densely packed metropolitan area. It was the town's cow pasture in 1634. That's also why the roads are all crazy in Boston, because they're all going to the cow pasture. You also have examples of commons in the ejidos, the Hispanic land grant communities, and in Hutterite colonies. All the way to community gardens, community grasslands, community forests. But what I want to focus on are those public lands that are managed by public agencies. The governance there really depends on the laws and regulations that are part of the United States federal law, federal system of laws, as opposed to the governance that happens in the other examples of commons I've given, which are more controlled by commissions, boards. Tradition and culture tends to direct what is being done and how it's being done. Local laws and practices tend to prevail. And those are more defined and more specific commons. But again, I want to look at the public lands that are controlled by agencies at this point. Now, those agencies can be at any level of government. In the federal government, our most common, the common examples that we're familiar with for instance, the U.S. Department of Agriculture would be the National Forest System, National Grassland System. We also have the Department of Interior with national parks, fish and wildlife managed refuges, and NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmosphere Administration. They deal with oceans and fish. Likewise, at the state level, we have systems of parks and state forests. We have Department of Natural Resources that care for the wildlife and fish. There's also some control over the lakes and reservoirs and the river beds. And that's a very interesting piece of state law, is who actually owns the riverbeds, and it varies from state to state. Likewise, you see the same sort of thing replicated at the county, city, and local level. And then there's some other public lands that we tend not to think much about, and that is median strips and road easements and shoulders and highways. You have your hand up?
Please. Do public lands legally include highways and streets and roads? Or are they not public lands?
It depends. They can be anything. They can be anything from a private road to a county.
What's a U.S. highway? Is that a...
U.S. highway is a state-owned highway.
So it's a public land?
It's a public commons, Department of Transportation. But because I'm focusing on productive surfaces, I haven't included the paved and developed surfaces that are linear. So what's so important about public land? Well, we just get all the necessities of life from public land. For instance, air, water, energy, shelter, clothing, medicine, beauty, relationships, and experiences. So it goes well beyond the Forest Service mantra of goods and services. Now, what we're finding is that these aren't just resources that we need, but also supporting those resources are systems and processes known as ecosystem services. And that's where we get our cornucopia of riches. And just what does nature do for us? And what are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services are defined as things that nature gives us for free, and they are unable to be duplicated by humans at the size, scale, and feasibility that is practical. So these are things that nature is doing that we're not really able to do. Produce oxygen, sequester carbon, filter out fine particles, absorb toxins. On the water side, by retaining snowpack and by having the forest humus layer, that is a reservoir of water that slowly is released, hopefully slowly, is released to streams and waterways and aquifers to meet, that helps meet our human needs. And then we have soils and habitat. Nature is very, very busy all the time building soils, sequestering carbon, cycling nutrients. It grows our food, it grows fiber, it supports microbes and fungi, which are extremely important to the health of the forest as well as grasslands and the soil itself. By doing all this, it creates self-sustaining habitats for wildlife and fish. It modifies microclimate to meet the needs of fish and wildlife, as well as humans. It provides shelter and stabilizes slopes. And it also provides setting for the metaphysical needs that we have, the spiritual renewal, the inspiration, the experiences, and recreation, of course. But then it does special tricks. It does pollination, decomposition and recycling of waste, and really the magic trick of all, converting energy to matter through photosynthesis. But right now we're being faced with a quadruplex of crises. We have a population boom, we have peak oil, we have climate change, and we have the pending economic collapse. And all of these are interacting and reacting with each other and playing upon each other. And then I thought, wait a minute, it's not a quadruplex. We've got mandatory growth, which knocks all of these out of whack and makes them even worse than they already are. And what are the effects on public land and public land management? Well, Complexities, demands, and the threats increase, while budgets and their ability to manage decrease. That's a problem. So the challenge is making choices that are conducive to life, because you only get two choices. You either make a choice conducive to life or a choice conducive to death. So the question is, how do we ensure the sustainability of public lands, their resources and ecosystem services in times of multiple crises when the public land managers are going to lack the capability to do so single-handedly? And what we're trying to do is ensure sustainability. Now, I absolutely adore the natural step framework. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to Google it and find out about it. This is a resource funnel that's a very fundamental diagram for the natural step framework. And I apologize that the lettering is light here, so I will read it for you. But essentially, you're looking at a funnel that's cut in half longitudinally. The top line represents life-supporting resources and services, which are decreasing. And the bottom line is demand, which is a demand for those very same resources and services. Where those lines cross, and they're coming incredibly close, is where we lose all sustainability and the ability to support life of all species. What we are trying to do with sustainability is stretch those sides of the funnel, stretch the neck open so that more species can pass through there successfully and thrive. There's 4 basic principles to sustainability, and I wish I had the time to go, wax eloquently about what each of these mean, and when I first became familiar with the natural step framework, I was told that it was based on 4 scientific principles, and 4 basic scientific laws, and as a result, 4 principles. And I thought there had to be more. Well, I've been thinking and working on this for 10 years, and there aren't more. These are the principles of sustainability. You have to reduce taking things out of the lithosphere and throwing it into the atmosphere and the biosphere. Think fossil fuels. You have to minimize the excess of new chemicals. Nature is completely capable of breaking down, ameliorating, mitigating anything that we throw at her, except she needs time to do it. Our little trick is that we're throwing too many things into our natural environment too fast, at a much faster rate than nature can handle it. Protect and expand productive surfaces. We're losing habitat and land all the time to development and conversion. Absolutely essential that we retain that. And finally, the human component there. Equitably distribute resources. So we happen to be in violation of all of those principles of sustainability. Oops. So what does that result in? It results in very specific threats to our public lands, to our commons. Specifically, the threats include the marked decline in local fish and wildlife populations from poaching, but that's not the only thing. And I have done the research on this that shows that during the Depression, during strikes or layoffs where communities are near public lands, you see an immediate decline in fish and wildlife populations. And I hate to use the word poaching because it's so pejorative and people are actually just trying to feed themselves and their family, but I use it because it's a common term that we understand that you're taking fish and wildlife outside of a prescribed set of regulations. We also see illegal uses for cash flow, which can be quite dangerous to other people seeking to use the public lands for inspiration. Well, I don't know, I guess. Pot farms, meth labs, making moonshine, these are all happening on public lands, and the rate of that occurrence is increasing. Likewise, overgrazing of cattle in particular, and overharvest of trees, berries, roots, plants for subsistence or profit. Roots, ginseng right now, there's a huge spike in removal of ginseng from national forests in this area because people can sell it for a profit. Likewise, I read that there's a huge increase in the amount of timber poaching, as it's called, in the national forests in Virginia. And the thing that made me cringe is that the primary reason for people cutting down these large oaks and secreting them off is for personal use firewood. That's worrisome. You also have invasive species from poor management or poor enforcement of regulations that would prevent those species from coming onto public land. Also, homeless people move onto public lands. It's called squatting, again, a pejorative term, but we see it many times in areas where homeless levels rise, or resort areas where a normal person with a normal income cannot afford housing. So they do what they need to do. And also we see water diversions for private use. This is a very important theft of the commons. And then from peak oil and climate change, intensification of energy development, drill baby drill, and more land is disturbed for extraction of resources. But species are really in need of lands to migrate into and through to get to habitats where they can survive, because their current habitats are changing so dramatically, they're being forced out or up. Drought as a result of climate change, insect epidemics that are hitting literally in Montana alone, over 200 million acres on public lands are now dead. Trees are now dead because of insect infestation. Perverse seasonal conditions where it's hot when it should be cold and cold when it should be hot, very difficult on plants. Intense weather events, and also higher CO2 concentrations, very interestingly, tend to favor invasive species like cheatgrass and mesquite. But the public land managers have less budget, therefore less travel, less mobility, less personnel, therefore less maintenance and less enforcement. So how can they mind the commons? With our help. It's the only solution. So what are our options? Well, we have old tools and we have new tools. By old tools, I mean things that we have currently that the federal and many state and local agencies do have authority already for. Just learning how to effectively use that, even though some of them have been on the books for 10 years or more. A community responsibility for local public lands. An eyes and ears program, that is, people just pay attention to what's going on, and instead of just calling and reporting instantly, they may go talk to their neighbor and say, you do realize your fence is like 100 feet over onto public lands, don't you? Sometimes that can embarrass people into moving it. If not, they bring in the agencies. Stewardship contracting. I'd love to talk to you about that. It's a very interesting way of approaching removing resources from the forest, but in a way that you're more concerned with what's left than what you're taking out. Grants for community co-management of public lands. Incentives for small local industry doing sustainable resource management. Volunteers, expanded policies for encouraging and engaging people in collaborative processes, memorandum of understanding that allow all of this to happen and define how that might happen. Likewise, shared maintenance agreements that also define who's doing what, where, and when. But I'm very interested in making it a lot more interesting. That is, can we develop cooperatives for timber, firewood, and post and pole harvest and processing that is not dependent on public agency resources, their personnel and their budgets. Looking at trading labor or services for a campsite, a place to live, or for certain goods from the forest. But if you don't have money, what else can you contribute? Maintain the trail, and you get to have all the firewood you want. What about homeless communities being developed in repurposed campsites? We're not going to have a lot of tourists, driving around in large RVs. So can we allow those facilities to be used for people who need a place to live? It would be fairly primitive, but it's a heck of a lot more organized and positive than just sneaking around and trying to camp in places, because on national forests there's a law that you cannot stay in any one location for longer than 2 weeks. That's specifically to prevent the squatting. And so people are having to hide somewhere for 2 weeks and create very innovative and not so innovative sanitation techniques, and then moving on and trashing somewhere else. Another idea, forest food and medicinal plant cooperatives or markets. The forests are abundant with foods and medicinal plants, and it's a wonderful renewable resource as long as it's treated sustainably. So can there be cooperatives of perhaps the people that are weaving baskets? You know, can they be in charge of areas where we have the best reeds and cordage available? It could make sense. Local horse-mounted protection teams. There's a lot of people, particularly in the West, that have horses. They like to get out in the woods and ride. Can they be the eyes and ears? Can they be given the responsibility? I know there's issues with authority and all that, but can they be given the responsibility for watching what's happening in our collective commons? Water masters. Again, people who are monitoring and watching where's the water going and making sure that there is that equitable distribution piece of the sustainability principles. Can we change the mission of the agencies? Rather than to support the wants and needs of industry, which many organizations, particularly state agencies, unfortunately seem to have as their subtext on the mission, can we say, you are to feed, clothe, and provide biomass energy to the local communities? And can we replace the agencies with something better? I mean, a lot of people have talked for years about getting rid of the Forest Service or getting rid of some agency. Well, that's fine and dandy as long as you have a better replacement. Getting rid of something without a good replacement is going to create a vacuum, and some very negative things can happen. But what I want to know is, what else can we be doing? And that's why I wanted to bring this presentation to this group, because I'm sure you guys have a tremendous amount of ideas, thoughts, concerns, things that are going to help in building this. And when I say building this, I'd like to put together a guide that public land management agencies can turn to. Because Milton Friedman once said, and I don't quote Milton Friedman very often, but one time he said something good, that when the crisis hits, people are going to be looking for the best ideas that are laying about. So I want to get a lot of good ideas and have them laying about. And I want to close with one of my favorite quotations from Bill McDonough. How will we know when we're successful in minding the commons? We'll know we're successful when we learn to love the grandchildren of all species for all time. Thank you.